folks. You're listening to the Jobs Podcast. I am your host, Tim Hendricks. Your time is valuable. I'm not going to waste it. Let's get right to the interview. Hey, Jeremy, welcome to the Jobs Podcast. Thanks for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm well. Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me.
You bet. So let's start off by giving us your job title. It's an ecological, what is it again?
I guess you could say a couple things. I'm an ecologist or a biologist, and I work as an environmental consultant.
Okay. Is the consulting part the big umbrella that you use all of your biology training and whatnot to do? Is that how that works?
It is. That's the industry I work in, is the consulting industry. But by way of education and experience, I'm a scientist. I'm a biologist, or some people like to say ecologist, depending on what field of study you're focused on.
Cool. Do you spend a lot of time behind a desk, or are you traveling a lot? Or are you out in the middle of nowhere counting leaves, or what is it that you spend the majority of your day doing?
It's a bit of everything these days. As I get a bit longer in the tooth and I spend more time at the desk, talking to clients and writing reports and helping other younger biologists kind of come up in their career. But I still get out in the field a good bit and do some field studies. I travel and meet with regulatory agencies, state agencies, federal agencies. Sometimes it's counting leaves, sometimes it's counting trees, sometimes it's trapping wildlife. It's a pretty big umbrella that we do, and it's all pretty interesting.
Cool. I want to dive into that. You said that you help younger folks coming up, and that's kind of a big bulk of what our podcast is all about. So let's start off by just telling us a quick snapshot about where were you born, your childhood, kind of what got you into the career that you're in today.
Yeah, I was born in Missouri. Oh, actually, I take that back. I was born in Illinois. I lived in Peoria, Illinois for about 2 weeks of my life, I think. And then I really grew up in Missouri, in Marshfield, Missouri. Lived there my entire life until I went off to college. Went to college at Central Missouri State University in northern Missouri. And then after that, I wound up moving to Texas, and I've been in Austin, Texas ever since.
Okay. What was your first step after college? Did you focus on, you said you had a degree in biology. Was there some early indications that you might want to get into the line of work that you're in, or did you just want to keep going down something you found interesting, or what was your path that kind of started you down this road where you ended up where you're at now?
I mean, I was an outdoorsy kid. I think back in the 80s, we all were to some degree.
Yeah.
You just played outside all the time. We had a good friend group and some kind of little woodlands around us where we grew up. So we spent a lot of time running around the woods, building forts, just being outdoors. I think that gets you interested in things like camping and, maybe I didn't know it at the time, but wildlife and vegetation. I thought it was all pretty interesting. But at that point in your life, you're just running around and having fun. But I do remember there was a film back in I want to say it was the 90s, maybe. It was a Sean Connery film called Medicine Man. And he plays a scientist that's researching, I think, the cure for cancer or AIDS. I can't remember which it was. But he travels to the Amazon rainforest and studying plants to try to find cures for this disease. And it's a really interesting film. It's got a lot of action, and it turns out it's all about this rare bromeliad plant that has the key to the cure. And ever since I saw that, I just thought, man, that just sounds like the most interesting job, where you get to travel around the world, studying different things. Hopefully there's some purpose behind what you're studying. And you get to see a lot of different aspects of nature, because everywhere you go, it's going to be different. And that was it. From that point on, I knew exactly what I wanted to do professionally. I didn't know this job existed, to be honest, but I knew this is the job I wanted. And I knew I had to get a degree in biology, or a couple of degrees in biology, to get there. And I just kind of set out on that path and made it happen.
When you got your degree, I assume that you went to look at like the DNR, Department of Conservation, something along those lines. Is that where you were thinking you would go?
It was, yeah. I went to college in Missouri, And right before I graduated, the summer before I graduated, I actually had a temporary research job with the Missouri Department of Conservation. I was
Okay.
working down in southeast Missouri, working as an assistant research botanist. And I can tell you right now, it was a dream job. I had one semester left in college. I spent a whole summer living in the Mark Twain National Forest with about 30 or 40 other biologists, and we were all studying different things. And it was an amazing summer. And that was kind of the path that I thought was in front of me. Working for an agency, DNR, Fish and Wildlife, Department of Conservation. Any state has a variety of those agencies, and I thought I would just kind of figure out whatever path got me into that kind of role in the right geography, and that's where I started.
So you had that summer, then you finished your college education, then you moved to Texas. Is that right?
Uh, Sort of. I went back to college for a semester to finish up, and when I graduated, I had this old Volkswagen camper van, and I had some acquaintances in Alaska. And so I kind of had connections to a job with Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and I was going to go up and do some fisheries work, mostly kind of tagging salmon as they make their spring runs. And then you do use radio telemetry to follow them and kind of see what the migrational patterns are. And you kind of get a lot of population estimate data doing that. And that was the goal. So my then girlfriend and I drove to Alaska from Missouri and lived in that van for about 3 or 4 months. Uh, and it turns out the job fell through. A couple of other jobs that kind of came up in the meantime, but they would have kept me in Alaska later into the fall than I wanted to be. And I really didn't want to drive a Volkswagen van home from Alaska in late November, early December.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a good idea.
Yeah, so we took some kind of temporary jobs in the canneries, fish cannery, made some money, hiked around, and really had a good time. And then we drove back, and she was from Austin, and we made our trip back through Missouri and went back down to Austin, and we are going to visit her family. And the goal was to actually turn back around, drive back to Missoula, Montana, and kind of set up shop there because I wanted to go to graduate school at the University of Montana. And when we got to Texas, the motor on my van just really started to give out after such a long trip. And we limped into Austin and went to her family's house and I parked the van in her dad's barn, and it stayed there for the next 7 years. And I've been here ever since.
The time in Alaska, I have been to a number of states, but I have not been to Alaska. And that's one of my, I guess, a bucket list, for lack of a better word. Is it as awesome as I think it is, as far as just the majestic mountains and whatnot?
Yeah, for sure. It's gorgeous. It's wild. It's huge. It's rugged. Yeah, I would. It's really impressive. I will say it's a little. I'm a big fan of Montana. If you've ever spent any time in Western Montana.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
My one statement I tell this to a lot of people who are thinking about going to Alaska, and I think everyone has a different opinion of Alaska. Alaska is wild and rugged and gorgeous, but you get a lot more gray skies in Alaska than you get in Montana. Montana's just always got those gorgeous blue skies that go on forever. So I'm kind of a Montana person, but
right.
Pretty.
Well, if you spent much time in the canneries, you probably didn't get to enjoy the nice part of Alaska. I'd imagine cannery work was pretty rough.
It was interesting. It wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
I got lucky and worked in one of the row houses where I was processing salmon roe fish eggs for the Japanese caviar industry.
Oh.
So it was not difficult work. It was just long hours, 18-hour days, just working with fish roe.
Good grief.
Yeah, but you made a lot of money in a short amount of time.
Yeah. So your van broke down. You're stuck in Austin. Now what?
Yeah, the thought was, find another job somewhere across the country in environmental sciences and biological sciences. And in those days there was a website that was maintained by Texas A&M University, and it's still there. It's still a very useful website. It's called the Texas A&M Wildlife and Fisheries Jobs Board, and
Okay.
I have hired people from that jobs board in recent years, and I always direct up and coming biologists that are thinking about, as they prepare to graduate. I always direct them to that jobs board. It's a good kind of first stop to start looking for some job opportunities. Back then, that was the only thing like it. Everybody who was an up and coming biologist went to the jobs board and really tried to find jobs there. And they posted national positions, and a lot of them were short term positions back in the day. And that's kind of how you had to get your start in the industry I'm in. Is you do a lot of short term, seasonal, temporary positions until you could build a resume and then get into a permanent position in, say, consulting or at an agency. So I looked for jobs all over the U.S. in my time, sitting around in Austin, and I found a job with the University of Georgia. It was a wildlife research technician role, short term, about 6 months. And I thought, great, here's another chance to build the resume. So my girlfriend stayed in Austin, and I bought an old Subaru for $1,200, and I drove to Georgia. And I lived there for 6 months trapping quail. I was working on a long-term quail study, and we were, collaring quail, so we fit a little collar around their neck, and then we go out and track them with radio telemetry equipment, and then bring that into GIS, and then you can map out and model their populations and kind of see what sort of habitat they're using, what kind of population distribution they have, and that helps with quail management over time.
The radio telemetry thing, has that been replaced by satellite or GP? I mean, is that old technology now, or is that still regularly used when you're doing tracking of that type?
Yeah, it's old technology, but it's still pretty effective in certain applications. Fish and game still radio collars big herbivores, moose and elk, bears, things like that, and then they fly in helicopters, and they can, or fixed wing aircraft, and that's a kind of a more efficient way of tracking. GPS collars are certainly on the forefront these days. A lot of the wolves that you've probably read about in the news in Yellowstone, those are all GPS collared, and they can track those remotely. Those are great. Sometimes the old technology is kind of interesting and still good to use.
Yeah.
And then there's PIT tags, passive integrated transponder tags that we use sometimes. Those are kind of old technology, but still very much applicable in certain.
Is that a radio frequency type, or is that some other?
Yeah, that's right. They're like an RFID tag. So,
okay.
You can insert them under the skin of fish or any organism really. We use them a lot in freshwater mussels these days, and then you go back with a scanner and you can kind of wand for them if you know generally where they are, and you can find them. That's usually for close-in application, and if you know where they are, you can trap them, and then you can get them in hand and scan them, and then that gives you a lot of specific data about that individual in particular, like when you first trapped it, when you tagged it, the weight, the size, and you can kind of monitor growth and stuff like that. So yeah, lots of different technology for different applications.
Just out of curiosity, those things that you said you put underneath the skin of, say, a fish or a mussel, what have you, how large is something like that? Is it about the size of a grain of rice, or is it smaller? Or?
Yeah, it's probably a good estimate. Some of them, they do have size ranges. You can get larger pit tags if you need to have a little stronger frequency response. But I'd say size of a grain of rice, 12 millimeters, 9 to 12 millimeters are usually the sizes that we purchase and use on projects. So I think that's probably maybe about the size of the grain, maybe just a touch bigger.
Not to go down a rabbit hole, but when you talked about tracking bears and moose and whatnot, I've watched a number of those, nature shows and Crocodile Hunter and all that kind of stuff growing up. And I've often wondered, you'll see a bear or an elk or moose that has a big collar around its neck, and it's got that big thing on it. And I'm often wondering, do other animals come up to them and be like, dude, Larry, what is that thing around your neck? Do they treat the animals differently that have that thing on them, or do they not even really pay attention to it?
That's a good question. I've actually wondered that myself. I've also wondered if it kind of benefits other animals in a way. You know, if you're a bear and you're kind of in a scrum with another big bear, you're fighting over range or resources. I mean, if you could get a paw on that thing and pull down on it, imagine you've got a dog and you need to grab the collar to kind of get a hold of them. I wonder if another bear could do that to a bear that does have a collar on him and maybe get some advantage. But yeah, I don't know. I'm sure there's been some published literature on that, whether there's any kind of bias towards animals that have a collar or not. I think maybe at the end of the day, it probably not enough to be significant in the long term. You know,
I I would think if it was obvious that it was shortening the lives of different animals that are being tracked, that kind of data would rise to the surface over time.
Yeah. Especially when we use, I say we, the collective, we use those things in applications for endangered species all the time, and that's would undermine the whole point of monitoring those endangered populations if you're putting them at increased risk by
Oh, sure.
equipment to them.
Right.
Yeah. Somebody's
What's
probably.
what's the largest animal that you've ever had to tag? Have you ever been involved with tagging a bear and seen one sedated up close?
I haven't. No, probably the closest I came to it was when I was in Alaska. One of the jobs that Fish and Game offered me, they knew I knew how to weld, and they offered me a job to go north of Fairbanks and weld moose pins to trap moose, and then once we trapped them, we'd sedate them and collar them actually. And that was one of the jobs I just thought I don't want to be in Fairbanks, Alaska in late November.
No, you don't.
But no, in my line of work, especially these days, we usually work with smaller organisms. That's not everybody does, but yeah, probably the largest I've worked with. These mussels are pretty small; they're easy to handle. Lizards, turtles, other herpetological fauna. Yeah, most of the time, pretty small scale wildlife, small mammals, things like that. In my line of work, nothing
Is
terribly exciting.
is most of the stuff that you track, is that for Department of Conservation type data? I know that you said that you consult and you work for, I don't quite know the arena that you're in as far as if you're not working for the DNR or a conservation group of some kind, what private industries would typically seek your resources or your expertise to come over and say, hey, we're looking at building X, Y, and Z here, whether it's a mine or an amusement park or whatever. And we need to see if that's,
Yeah, that's a good question. And maybe I'll kind of circle back and pick up after my time at the University of Georgia. That might kind of help a little bit.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sure.
Yeah, so I finished that job, came back to Austin, and at the time my girlfriend was working for this biological consulting firm, and she was out in San Diego, California, working, basically doing kind of low end stuff. So she was serving as a biological monitor. There was a company that was installing fiber optic cables in roadside ditches, basically through urbanized San Diego. And there were these endangered arroyo toads that lived in that area. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife issued in one of the permits that was issued to this project that said you basically have to monitor for these toads while you're installing this fiber optic cable to make sure that your installation activities don't endanger them. And so she was hired along with numerous other young biologists to basically stand beside these these little HDD directional drilling rigs to install these cables. And it's pretty boring work when you serve as a biological monitor, but it paid well. And then she got on a couple of other projects, and that was my first foray into consulting. I didn't even know the industry existed before that. And I
Okay.
came from Georgia, and I thought, wow, that's really kind of what I want to do. That's more in line with this idea, this dream job I had of traveling around as a scientist, working on different types of projects, not just being focused on one particular species or one aspect of environmental ecological consulting. I just wanted to do a little bit of everything, and that consulting job kind of summed it all up for me. So I started looking for jobs, and Austin was a great place because Austin's a little more progressive as a city, and there are a lot of environmental consulting firms and jobs here in Austin. More so
Okay.
these. I mean, this was 2001, I think. So there were still some companies back then, but the city's grown a lot, and this industry's grown a lot. So there are more of these jobs available these days. But I found a job, started working with a small local firm. They really just tried to get my foot in the door. I did a lot of work early on behind drilling rigs, geotechnical drilling rigs, because I had some geological, experience from college. Traveled around all over the South, Texas, New Mexico, Louisiana, and just kind of worked on drilling projects, got the occasional biological project, and just gained more and more experience. And then after about 7 years, I kind of thought, well, I really probably need to go back to graduate school and get a master's degree if I want to advance. So I went to Texas State University, got a master's degree while I was still working for this consulting firm. And eventually I went on to another consulting firm that just had better access to more of the real scientific projects that I wanted to work on. And then it's just kind of grown from there. So I've been doing this for about 24 years now. But yeah, environmental consulting, to answer the question, is I hate to say this because I think it's going to sound kind of terrible, but we're almost like attorneys, and that gives me the willies to say that. But we're hired by companies, and a lot of times we interface with attorneys. Say there's a company that wants to, like you said, develop a mine, or they want to drill a bunch of oil wells, or they want to build a pipeline. There needs to be some level of environmental due diligence in that process where that company, they want to limit their exposure to litigation and risk. They don't want to be sued by somebody because they didn't
Sure.
look at the environmental implications. So
Yeah.
they'll hire people like us, and sometimes they'll hire attorneys, and attorneys will hire us. And then we look at the full breadth of their project, and we try to think through what type of environmental impacts they may have. And it could be broad range, it could be very focused. And we study it. Sometimes that means we physically go out and we trap wildlife and we study what wildlife is there. Sometimes it's very high level and we just do desktop level reports, and we look at resources and write technical reports for them. Uh, and then we give our best recommendations to these developers or the clients, whoever they may be, and they pay us, and we get paid kind of like an attorney does on a retainer or on a fixed number of hours that we bill to the project. And it works very much like that kind of attorney world in the way we're contracted. But yeah, that's kind of the bulk of our work. Sometimes we contract directly with the regulatory agencies like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers or U.S. Fish and Wildlife or the Department of Conservation. So there are other client avenues for us, but most of the time it's private commercial development. A lot of our clientele is the oil and gas industry or the energy industry. And I work for a global firm, so we have clients all around the world and we have projects all over.
Have you been able to travel to other places besides the United States?
I had, yeah. The company I work for, we're headquartered in Amsterdam in the
Oh,
Netherlands. So
okay.
we're a Dutch firm. Our U.S. headquarters is in Denver.
Okay.
So I interface with our international colleagues. I have some good friends that have developed through that over the years. Worked on a few projects here and there. I'm in Texas. I'm in Austin, Texas. So we do some border infrastructure projects. So I do some work in Mexico across the border. Not really extensive work. It's just kind of border environment, just over the border. I've supported some projects in other parts of the world. Trying to think what comes to mind. We've done some offshore work in the North Sea off of the coast of off of UK, the coast of UK. I've kind of done very remote type support of those projects, technical expertise with respect to fisheries and things like that. I haven't been on the ground on those projects. I have traveled over to some of our Dutch offices and met with clients there. And then this is a sidebar, but our company is mostly European, and every winter we have a soccer tournament in Germany, which is kind of a big networking event for all of our folks to get together and just kind of meet and grow and exchange ideas. So I tend to go to our Germany soccer tournament every February or March and play in a tournament, and then just get to meet a lot of folks that I wouldn't get to meet otherwise.
That would be fun. I mean, I grew up playing soccer, so I know a lot of Americans don't really get into it in comparison to baseball or football, American football.
Yeah.
But soccer is, man, the fans anywhere else on the globe are just about as rabid as you can possibly be. They take it so serious.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I'm a big fan of soccer, and I didn't grow up with it.
Yeah.
We didn't have it in Marshville, Missouri as a kid.
Right.
But yeah, big fan these days.
I had a question. You mentioned something a bit ago when you were working with the different firms, and when you sit down to these meetings, is it usually pretty professional and everybody gets along, or is there a low level tension there where you're kind of fighting each other professionally, or is it kind of we both have a job to do and we each know where each other's line is, and how's the interaction between those two entities when you sit down to look over a project?
Yeah, it's a good question. Most of the time, it's very professional and very cordial. I've got some great relationships with folks at these other firms that hire us. They're repeat clients, people that you work with for years, and you get to know them very well. So I'll have my counterpart that works for the client at all these different firms and talk all the time, can give them a ring anytime. Sometimes I hang out with them socially outside of work too. So there's definitely some really good relationships there. Uh, the company I work for, we're not just scientists. We also have probably the bulk of our employees globally are actually engineers of one form or another. So we do a lot of engineering, and there's a lot of cross coordination of these different skill sets on projects. So client A may come to us and want to develop a rather large petrochemical plant on the coast somewhere. And that takes a lot of really diverse skill sets to do that. And these are
Sure.
very, very big projects, very complicated to get off the ground. The funding alone is immense. All you need a lot of different technical subject matter experts to kind of come to the table at once and really start from the beginning in that planning process. So I oftentimes sit at that table from an environmental planning perspective because it's so complex to get permits for projects like that and to evaluate all the environmental impacts that might be associated with it. And you're doing this, years in advance of the actual construction of the project. And at the same time, at that same table, there are engineers talking about, design concepts and feasibility studies and what can and can't be done. So you're very much working in this iterative process with those people, trying to say, well, look, you can do that physically, but just be aware that if you build that component in that location, it's going to require this extra permitting step, which might take you another 18 months and, $100 billion. So what's more important, the schedule or the cost? And you kind of work through that process. So they become very constructive processes. And I'd say these days, rarely are those contentious conversations because everyone's got a shared goal, at the end of the day, to support the client and help the client to deliver whatever project they're trying to develop.
Sure.
But I will say I have worked on some projects where it isn't as cordial, and those tend to be smaller projects that are maybe not as well funded, or smaller companies, smaller developers trying to develop them that aren't as keen on adhering to all the environmental regulations. So they just want to get their project built. And sometimes they look at people like me as the problem. Here comes the environmental guy telling me what I can't do. But that happens for sure, but it's rare these days. Most of our clients, these days, most big industries understand the importance of environmental stewardship,
Yes.
environmental protection, the potential long-term adverse impacts of climate change, what that means to their bottom dollar sometimes too. So even if they don't purely agree about the scientific merit of something, they definitely agree that their financial accounts may be affected by things. So, and litigation is a big concern. So most of the big clients that we work for, they understand that they need to do this environmental due diligence and they need to do it right to get their project off the ground in the right way. So they're very supportive of our time and fully embrace us.
Well, that's good. You had talked a little bit ago about how your pay structure is similar to that of an attorney's by either retainer or by project, etc. I'm not specifically asking you what you make, but if someone is listening and they're thinking about getting into this line of work, when you were doing those short-term jobs and whatnot, was that typically a hourly wage for 40 hours a week, or was that you'll be paid this much, like a stipend, or how does the pay early on start or work, and then how does it transition to like your current type job?
Sure. Early on, before I was in consulting, when you're working those kind of temporary agency jobs, the pay is pretty terrible. Not gonna,
Yeah.
but you're usually, kind of a broke college kid, and you can
Yeah.
absorb that. You're more interested in the experience that you're gaining and the opportunity. And if you're financially able to make very little money and go live somewhere remotely and maybe make a couple of great friends and do something interesting and build your resume, then those are fantastic opportunities. And I would still recommend that young biologists coming out of college think about that and maybe go that route, because as someone who now years later is in the hiring process, and I get to look at these resumes, those are the kind of things that I look for. I want to see that someone's got some experience and they've maybe done a few different things, and they're not just coming full force right out of college with a lot of energy and enthusiasm, but maybe absolutely no real world experience. So those are great ways to get into any role in the sciences. I think in the applied sciences, as we say, which is kind of what I do. Once and those are low paying. They're usually a monthly stipend or allowance, or a very very small hourly rate for 40 hours a week, short term basis. Maybe 3 months, 6 months. A lot of times it's during the field season, the growing season or the active
Oh,
season,
sure.
whatever species. Sometimes you're doing nest surveys for birds, for example, and that particular bird species only nests from mid-March to early June. So it's a very short window to go out and do the studies, collect the data, and then do some reporting on the back end. So they can be very short-term projects, or they can be long-term. When you get into consulting, we usually hire full-time permanent staff, salaried, benefits, all of those things, and the money is much better than those temporary positions. As you're kind of trying to get some experience. I think it's a very competitive industry, especially these days, because the economy's strong. So there's a lot of growth and development across the U.S., and that means there just needs to be more folks like us doing these impact and assessments and environmental due diligence reports and field studies. So it can be challenging right now, actually, to just find good staff and hire them. So it's a great time, but that does fluctuate. When the economy is not so strong, the jobs start to slow up a little bit. But it's a stable industry that it's always going to be here. Okay, well, I hope so. But yeah, the pay then goes up pretty dramatically, I would say, the longer you do it, as you get into more senior level positions, and you're seen as a subject matter expert, or a technical expert. That's kind of where I'm at these days. You do the job long enough, you really know the ins and outs, and then you're brought on as an advisor to the client. So again, you're sitting at the table with the client, telling them your thoughts on how the process should go, years in advance, and those positions definitely pay well.
Your degree, now I forget the exact time frame. Was it about 9 years between when you graduated from with your bachelor's to where you went and got your master's? Is that right?
I think that's right. I started about 7 years apart, and then it takes a couple of years.
Okay.
But yeah, that sounds right.
Would you recommend that if you could go back and do it over again, would you just get your master's right from the get-go? Or do you think it benefited you to go out and get some real world experience that then you could apply that experience and that knowledge to the master's to kind of further your learning?
I don't know that I would recommend either approach. Hmm. I mean, I've seen both approaches be very successful for folks. I I didn't stay in school. Well, I took a little bit of a gap because I wanted to work, and I always thought I would need to go back to graduate school. But after 4 years of college, I kind of wanted a break. I wanted to make some money, and I wanted to just get out there and get some experience, and also figure out what I really wanted to do, because what I wanted to study kind of changed over the years. Whether it was more plant related or more wildlife related or this and that. So I think working for 7 years definitely helped me kind of hone in on what aspects of my career I really liked, and that was important. Because this is going to be my career, for the rest of
Yeah.
my life. I definitely think going back to school after working for 7 years made me a much better student, and grad school was a breeze. And I think that's maybe the one advantage of the folks who kind of stick around and do an undergraduate degree, and then they stay and get their graduate, their master's degree. I've seen and heard other folks maybe lament that a little bit. It's a little bit harder because they're just so burnt out on school at that point, and all they've known is school. And I think working for 7 years in kind of I would say consulting can be a little bit of a high stress environment because it's very fast paced. You learn how to become a really fast, efficient writer, and you can write a lot. And grad school is all about writing papers. So I felt like I didn't feel like grad school was all that challenging when I got there.
I don't know if you hear that very often.
Yeah. Yeah, I really enjoyed graduate school, and I was working a full time job at the time, and I actually had my first kid at that time. So it was, maybe I just don't remember because I was so sleep deprived.
That's possible. What would you say if someone just came up to you on the street and said, "What do you like most about your job?" Can you sum that up in one thing, or are there multiple things that would compete for the top of the list?
I think there's probably multiple things, but if you really wanted me to kind of be specific, I would say the diversity, the project diversity, the work diversity. It's something different and new every day.
Right.
And as someone who really needs a lot of diversity because I get bored easily, that means a lot to me.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It's not the same thing, and it brings a different level of excitement each time when you come in. Like, all right, we're on to a new thing now. It's not just Groundhog Day over and over for 30 years. So,
Yeah, yeah. Uh,
what? Go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, I kind of tied into that diversity is you get to travel a lot, so you're seeing a lot of different things. Again, projects are different every day, so you might be in a different state from one day to the next, and working with a different species or a different aspect of the project. So it's all tied together. It's different and interesting all the time.
If someone is a big time nature lover and loves to be outdoors, it sounds like your line of work is going to be of interest to them.
I think so. Yeah, yeah. Most folks that are in this line of work, yeah, when you ask them to tell you a little bit about themselves, they kind of all blend into the same person after a while. They love to camp, they love to hike, they love dogs, they love to be outside. Yeah, yeah, pretty common trait.
What do you, every job has good things and bad things. So, what would you say that you dislike most about your job?
If I'm being completely honest, consulting can be a grind.
Yeah.
As much as I love that diversity, it's fast paced, and our clients want a lot from us. They want it fast. They want quick turnarounds. They're demanding. They're paying us a lot of money to give them what they need. Uh, so it can be a grind, and when you've done it for as long as I have, it's a long grind. So there are definitely days where yeah, I'm a little tired and I could use a break, and having some time off of work is nice. But then you find a way to recharge your battery and come back. And the reason I've been doing it this long is because of the diversity and the people too. I love the people. I've got a lot of great friends in this industry, but I do still like being challenged every day on a different project that's new and not the same.
Sure. Have there been any big technological changes or equipment or approaches? I'm kind of thinking specifically about the tagging or the tracking type equipment that is used. Maybe it's no longer radio, but it's more GPS, satellite type stuff. But has there been anything that has really stood out to you in your industry that has changed in the time that you've been there, that you've just seen it progress into now it's what we use every single day, but 15 years ago, it was cutting edge technology?
Yeah, yeah, GIS for sure.
Oh, okay.
Uh, Yeah, today people probably just assume GIS has been around forever, right? It's so common in everything we use. It's in our pocket every day. When I started, it was 20 some odd years ago. GIS was still, that was early 2000s. It was still kind of expensive technology. It wasn't as precise or available as it is today. We used to rent these handheld GPS units that were very bulky. They weren't very sophisticated. You could collect, a couple data points in the field and tie them together with a line. And the process to uh, analyze that data on the back end, like ArcGIS, the software, that wasn't very well developed or advanced at that time, still pretty rudimentary. So when I first started, it's funny because I worked for a company that was very old. It was formed in the 1950s. It was kind of an old school mom and pop firm. And they had a lot of old reports and files and boxes. And I would look at those sometimes because we'd have to kind of refer back to an old project and see what had been done. And I'd pull out these hard copy reports, and quite literally, they would have photos that you would take on like a film camera and get them developed at Walgreens or Walmart. They would take those photos and they would just, when they were writing the report in their Microsoft Word version, they would just leave extra space on the page and they would staple or glue the photo onto that page. And then they would bind it, and that would be a bound report, and that would be the product that they would give to the client. That's what the client was paying for. And I remember when I first saw those, I thought, this is the most bizarre thing. This seems so ridiculously cheap and old school. So anyway, I say that because at that time we were using Microsoft Word to create maps. So we would literally scan a photo into Microsoft Word, which seemed pretty high
Ugh,
tech at the time. And then we would use
yeah.
paint tools to draw lines over it and draw a polygon around a project side or put some points on where we found something interesting. And then there's a whole lot of processing to just kind of save that and then export it as like a JPEG of an image and then get it into your report in Microsoft Word and then print that. So it looked pretty good on the back end when you printed it, but it was a lot of messy, very rudimentary processing on the front end to make that happen. And at the time, we thought that was fairly high tech. And then
Yeah.
now everything's done in ArcGIS, and it's so simple and it's so slick and smooth, and it's all tied to metadata, and it's got a lot of like really important data kind of built into it. So like when I was looking back at those reports with stapled in, photographs, that seemed really old school. And now when I look back at the way we used to make maps, that seems really old school. And there'll be more things. But yeah, GIS is such an integrated part of our process these days. And the technology we use to collect the data in the field is so much more advanced. We use tablets now for everything. It's all tied through the cloud. So in real time, our GIS processors can be sitting quite literally. We have folks in India that can process the data as we're collecting it in the field from West Texas, and they're manipulating it and putting it into these different displays, and they can run analytics on it. They can
Jeez.
quantify things, they can calculate things, they can spit out some maps that we can then put in a report. It's yeah, that part of the puzzle is much more advanced these days, and it seems like such a basic part of it, but we use it every single day. So I'd say that's probably the biggest advance. And there's been a lot of advances in like other aspects of tracking and monitoring and trapping and things like that. But quite frankly, at the end of the day, a lot of what we do as biologists is still, just physically getting in the field and looking around with our eyes and making observations and studying things. But the data side, the GIS is definitely pretty important.
The the technological side certainly streamlines things and makes it faster and more efficient, and you have more data in the palm of your hand, but I still think you have to have human beings go and look at things and put their own eyes and their own hands on it to really complete the picture.
Yeah,
But
I agree. And then I think the next wave, and we're seeing it right now, is drone technology. And
oh, sure.
that's where people want that to go. They want to be able to send a drone out and do the same survey that a couple of biologists would do, and this drone would fly around, capture all the imagery, and then report back to the and it's integrated into GIS, and then it can tell GIS exactly what it's seeing. It's all the elements that we do as biologists that I hope will not ever be replaced by drones or AI, but they're certainly shift to try to make that happen. And that's probably the next big wave in our industry. Is just seeing drones and AI take a little bit more of the workload away from us real humans.
As you look back on your career from the very beginning when you got into it in college and then all the way to now, have you had any mentors or any teachers or supervisors, managers, et cetera, that either were a big impression on you, took you under their wing, that kind of a thing, and you just gained a lot from them in your life?
Yeah, definitely. Um, my first consulting job when I was in Austin, there was a guy, Tom Budner. He worked in the geotechnical lab in the same building I worked in. So I was out in the field most days doing studies, and he was in the lab doing other types of lab analyses. And yeah, I think I worked with him for 8 years while I was there. He was a huge mentor early on because partly I was fresh out of school, relatively fresh. I was also new to Texas and Austin especially, and I believe he gave just a lot of really great wisdom and insight into living in a different part of the world and seeing things differently and working for this kind of industry and how that might be different from other things I've experienced. So he was definitely an early mentor, and I really appreciate the time I spent with him and think back finally on that. And then I worked on a long-term project out in California in the Redwoods. I want to say that was maybe around 2006. And I started working with this other PhD wildlife biologist. He was in our Colorado office, but we were all living in these little beach houses out on the northern California coast for months, doing rare plant surveys and wetland surveys up in the redwoods. And he had been in the industry a while, and he was definitely his name was Lou Bridges. He was a really great mentor for a long time too, just kind of helping me see what the path looked like to become more professional, how to be more advanced, how to be more analytical, how it all kind of tied together in the consulting world. You're not just a scientist, but you're a consultant. You're advising clients. You're doing that in a certain way. And those two individuals were definitely early, very important mentors in my personal and professional development.
People like that can teach you so much. You can get a lot from textbooks and classrooms and articles, but sometimes piecing all of that knowledge together and then how to apply it to your job or to your life experience is usually one of the best ways. If you can have someone to kind of show you how to take what you know and then work with it, that sometimes is worth its weight in gold.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think
What?
having those people, in your world or in your orbit that care, that's
Yeah.
important, because not only are they showing you these things, but they care enough to show you these things, so they are helping you. There's a real fundamental part of that I think is important when you're taking someone under your wing or they're taking you under their wing. There has to be some common trust and real concern and compassion and the desire to kind of bring you up, so to speak. And I think that's a really important element of any kind of mentor relationship.
Yeah, I agree. By the way, the redwoods, I've been up to the redwoods and the sequoias, and you can never convey the size of those trees to somebody until they just go and see them for themselves. You can tell them the base of this tree is bigger than your full-size truck, and you can drive through one of them. And, they look like a skyscraper made out of wood. And you can say that, and people are like, oh, that sounds cool. And then you go there and you look up, and it's like, good grief, this is a tree. So anybody listening, you have to go there at least once in your life. But
So impressive.
I know. If somebody wanted to get into your line of work, you may have heard the term soft skills. What types of individuals, whether they're introverted, extroverted, mechanically inclined, what type of a person or a skill set does well in your line of work?
That's kind of a broad question, because there are a lot of different nuances to the kind of work I do. There are that gravitate a little more towards the planning side of consulting, so they don't go out in the field as much. They're not what I would say, hard scientists. They're doing more of the data analysis, the desktop analyses, and kind of planning projects from a different perspective. Whereas the field scientists like myself and others are out getting hands dirty and in the field in rough conditions. But I would say, for folks that are in my line of work who want to do the kind of work that I do, I actually talk about this a lot with colleagues, and because I hire and manage staff, this topic comes up a lot. But if I could, just piece together the perfect person, I think having a real independent streak is great. The ability, the willingness to learn on your own, whether that's reading through the literature, the scientific literature, just writing reports, being a great writer helps tremendously. Not being afraid to just put your own analysis on things, knowing full well that maybe you're a little bit experienced, but take the initiative to do something start to finish, write the report, make the interpretations that you would make, and then present that to more senior folks to provide some QA/QC. That's huge. I see a lot of young folks that are just hesitant. They don't exactly, they may be a little unsure of themselves, so they hesitate. And I really like to see people who are really ambitious, willing to go out on a limb, willing to be a little bit vulnerable in that situation, and just kind of make the best determination that they can. I think that's great. Being flexible is huge, because a lot of times you're going from project to project to project. You might be on a flight to Seattle tomorrow. You might be on a flight from Seattle to Ohio 2 days later, and then back to California. I mean, there's a lot of kind of crisscrossing, so flexibility is huge. Adaptability is huge. I think folks that I don't want to single people out, because I think this might single out a lot of people, but if you grew up in the country and you got some, country skills, and you can fix a few things, or you can just kind of figure your way out of things, I think that's huge. That kind of, maybe we used to call that just, common sense, but
Yeah.
I think that's huge. That, just having people that you can trust or rely on, because you might be in the field, you might be in a remote part of the redwoods in the mountains where you don't have a lot of cell reception, and your truck stalls out, or you have some other problem, or heaven forbid somebody gets hurt, and you got to kind of figure out how to get out of that situation pretty quick. And most of the time we plan well enough that these aren't life and death situations, but you still need to be able to figure it out without falling apart.
Right. That was a great answer. If you weren't in your current career, was there something that was always kind of rattling around in the back of your head that you thought, maybe I want to do that? And you look back and go, well, it probably wasn't a good fit, but I still think it would have been a cool career to have.
Yeah, probably three.
Okay.
There's three that I think about a lot, and I have thought about. I always thought I would love to be a farmer. I don't really know what that means in my head, to be honest. I just thought it'd be great to just have a farm and just be a farmer. It seems like a good way to go. Maybe that's more of a retirement goal. I don't know. I also thought being a mechanical engineer would be great. Really thought about that, but my math skills aren't great, and I'm the first to admit that. So I kind of early on said, you know what, maybe engineering's not my way to go. But I think engineering and kind of tinkering with things and fixing things and repairing things and coming up with new ideas, that was always something I was into as a kid. And then the last thing was just a writer. I love writing. I always loved writing. I think I definitely could have really enjoyed a career as either a creative writer, a novelist, or maybe a journalist, just traveling around the world and writing stories.
Do you write any?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say they probably weren't great fits at the time, and probably never will be, but still think that was fun.
Well, writing is something that you can do pretty much in any of your downtime. You can do that, long past retirement. Have you written anything that's ever been published, or do you have like a collection of short stories or a novel idea bouncing around in your head? Or
yeah, I think anybody who fancies himself a writer has some of those things bouncing around. I'll start by saying I write a lot professionally, but they're technical reports. I write big, long technical reports all day, every day. And, earlier, 10 years ago, I did a lot more kind of personal writing outside of work, creative writing. I feel like these days I just write too much for work, and it's hard to summon the creative juices
Yeah.
sometimes. But yeah, I've written short stories. I had a couple of novel ideas that I worked on for a while. I tried to get a few little short stories and essays published in certain publications that do that kind of thing, creative writing journals and stuff. Wrote a couple of little articles for the local newspaper, things like that. Had a couple small things, not really published, but reviewed and kind of looked at. And, I felt pretty good at least, putting myself out there and trying to get something published. And then a lot of the technical stuff I write for work, it is published in the public domain. And those things are very, very much out there for anybody to go and find. But yeah, it's probably always been the one real thing in the back of my mind that I wanted to do, wanted to be good at. It takes a lot of nerve, I feel like, to put yourself out there in that regard.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, this has been an incredibly interesting conversation. I don't know much. I didn't know anything about your line of work, really. And I always do a little bit of research before I have a guest on. And I kind of knew, but it was you peeled back a lot of layers of the onion. And, your brother is one of my best friends. And so I can tell you now that all the things he said about you are not true. You seem like a great guy, extremely intelligent. So he is wrong. And I told him I would say that. So, yeah.
Never believe that.
I know it. Hey, Jeremy, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me and share your story and some expertise about your line of work for folks that may have some interest in that. It's been a great conversation, and I hope you enjoyed yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tim. I do appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. It's been great getting to know you, and hopefully there's some other young biologists out there that hear this and maybe sparks a bit of passion for them to get into the industry.
Hopefully you have somebody coming up applying for you in the future and they say, "Hey, I heard you on the Jobs podcast." And then, you made an impression. So
there you go. Yep. That's all it takes.
All right, buddy. Thanks a lot. You have a good day.
Yeah, thanks. You too. Bye.
And that wraps up another episode of the Jobs podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. Hopefully you found that interesting. As always, I wait until the end of an interview to ask you to like, subscribe, and share. I feel it's important that I earn that support from you. Thanks again, and we will see you on the next one.